The story of Chernobyl ends with hundreds, if not thousands, of men, women, and children. But it begins with one man, a story of how one low-class individual worked his way up until he was placed in charge of managing the world's largest nuclear power plant, only to fall further than ever before. This is the story of Viktor Bryukhanov, the man who built Chernobyl. The son of a glazier and a cleaner, Bryukhanov was born into a tough life on the 1st of December 1935. Growing up in Tashkent, the oldest of four sons, Bryukhanov was old enough to remember World War II and the starvation he felt as the food supply was lost, and hundreds of thousands of immigrants evacuated from the front lines were relocated to the city. Bryukhanov became the only child out of the four to pursue a higher education, studying at the Energy Department of the Tashkent Polytechnic University. Bryukhanov graduated with honours and was even offered the opportunity to study at the Academy of Sciences of Uzbekistan, but declined a prestigious placement. Bryukhanov was far more interested in the act of producing electricity than understanding how it was produced. Bryukhanov chose the Uzbekistani Angren coal power plant, starting as an intern turbine driver, but rose through the ranks and found himself head of the department within a year. On a trip back to his home in Tashkent, he found the city destroyed by the April 26, 1966 earthquake, the old houses unable to withstand the tremors. His parents had moved to a new apartment building, and most of Tashkent was now being rebuilt in Soviet ideals, with numerous apartments and modernized factories. Alexei Makuhin, the then Ukrainian Ministry of Energy and Electrification, found Bryukhanov when he was deputy chief engineer of the Slavyanskaya coal power station, aged just 34, and selected him to be the director of the construction of the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant and its satellite city Pripyat. Bryukhanov first visited the site in the winter of 1970, knee-deep in snow when they came to the barren plot of land. Regardless, Bryukhanov took quickly to work, initially just instructing a mere 100 men and women from a small set of cabins in a forest clearing, joined by his family in August of 1970. Bryukhanov at once felt the struggle of this task. Many of the workers were uneducated, and the materials supplied by train were often defective. To combat this, Bryukhanov was forced to improvise, establishing workshops to manufacture the resources needed to build the Chernobyl nuclear power plant on site. But this did not prove effective, and construction lagged further and further. Regretting the job after just a year, Bryukhanov moved to resign from his post, which was refused. Bryukhanov was now trapped and forced to resume work, so he left the difficulties of construction to others, while he sought to recruit experienced professionals who could assist. Brykhanov's initial chief engineer was appointed to the Nuclear Safety Committee in Moscow, leading to the arrival of Vyacheslav Akimfeev. Akimfeev was soon joined by the new head of the turbine shop, Taras Plokhy, whom Brykhanov had worked with at Slavyanskaya, and Nikolai Fobin was given the position of head of the electrical shop. Akimfeev recommended that Brykhanov choose Dyatlov as the deputy head of the reactor shop. Unlike other leaders, Brykhanov strove to make living in Pripyat as enjoyable as he could. He managed to succeed in increasing food supplies to the city, so that all stores were stocked with multiple types of food, a rarity in the Soviet Union. He used spare steel to construct greenhouses nearby that could be used to grow tomatoes, and ensured the city was covered in greenery, in particular roses. However, running the city of Pripyat meant that all community issues were delegated to him. If someone wished to buy a motorbike, they would have to ask Brykhanov for permission. But Brykhanov continued despite the growing amount of pressure on him to manage an entire city whose population grew every year, as well as construct a nuclear power plant. On the 31st of December 1983, Brykhanov signed that Unit 4 had been completed, receiving a Hero of Socialist Labour Award for his work. His high status continued to reward him even years later, as in February of 1986, he was invited to the 27th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union as a member of the Ukrainian delegation, a very prestigious role and the height of his career. However, he was also aware of the design defects at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, and was put under immense pressure by the Ministry of Energy for such. Multiple demands were given to replace the roof with a fireproof cover, but Brykhanov lacked the supplies, and was given an exemption. Again, Brykhanov was pressured to install fireproof covering over the electrical wires that ran through the power plant. Again, he was granted an exception due to a lack of material. The party committee also made demands, many of which again could not be followed due to a lack of supplies. Brykhanov had never stood against the party or his superiors before, doubting his own powers, he would refuse to resign too, as whoever took his place would find themselves in the same position. Bryukhanov could only try to meet these criteria, drawing his attention away from work at the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant. At last, we have arrived on April 25th, 1986, and the party committee continued to make impossible demands, forcing Bryukhanov to travel to Kiev for a meeting. He did so, only briefly attending the daily meeting at the nuclear power plant, before making the long journey south. The party committee was unrelenting. Bryukhanov was being punished for not delivering on the construction of a series of barns for a nearby collective farm. Bryukhanov hadn't been given the materials to construct the barns in the first place. Then, they discussed proposals to restructure the administrative boundaries around northern Ukraine, ones that would rob Bryukhanov of the city of Pripyat. Again, Bryukhanov fought back. A tiresome day with hours of meetings, Bryukhanov eventually left as tired as ever, collecting his children from Kiev and making his way to Pripyat to enjoy the weekend. Instead of staying at their apartment in Pripyat, Bryukhanov opted to rest instead at his dacha outside of Pripyat. The family drove there and bedded down. Before he went to sleep, Bryukhanov made one last call to check on the status of all reactors at the nuclear power plant. Everything was normal. He was safe to go to sleep. The call summoning all members of the administration to the nuclear power plant was routed to his apartment in the White House. The phone call was pre-recorded, and therefore nobody knew he was unaware of the accident. The chain of command was momentarily broken. It wasn't until approximately 1:45 that one of the few engineers who knew Bryukhanov was at his dacha called him, making him aware of the accident. At once, he made his way to his white Volga and drove to the apartment. From there, he boarded a bus making its way straight to the nuclear power plant, joining many others who had been ordered there. As soon as he saw the remains of Unit 4 for the first time, there was only one thing on his mind: prison. He knew where he was ultimately going now. When he arrived, he made his way first to the office, calling the power plant's official telephone operator, and ordered them to summon the entire senior management to the nuclear power plant to determine how to battle the catastrophe. Then he ran from the main administration building to the Unit 4 control room, a distance of more than 600 meters. There, Dyatlov and Akimov were unable to clarify the situation, Akimov insisting the reactor was intact. It was all the information Bryukhanov could gather. He ran back. When Bryukhanov returned, he contacted the chief dosimetrist, demanding the radiation levels. He was told 3.6 rongens per hour, the maximum reading on their low-level dosimeters, meaning the value was likely to be much higher. On this information, Bryukhanov called the chairman of the Pripyat Party Committee, Vladimir Voloshyko, begging for an evacuation order. He refused. It might cause a panic. It was the last piece of information Bryukhanov took with him to the bunker and the large chamber reserved for this situation. Here, Bryukhanov had a delegated position, armed with telephones and other methods of communication, to allow Bryukhanov to coordinate the entire response from a small, isolated area where he seemed as lonely and defeated as ever. When Anatoly Sitnikov and Vladimir Chuganov arrived, Bryukhanov asked them to inspect Unit 4. When dosimetrists such as Serafim Vorobyov, chief of the nuclear power plant civil defense, came to the bunker with reports of 150 millirongens per hour outside of the main administration building, Brykhanov's hesitation due to the phone call with Voloshyko caused him to hesitate to act, to wait for more information, calling for the likes of Anatoly Dyatlov to the bunker to explain. Eventually, this would come with the dosimetrist, Korobenikov. He announced that the radiation levels were a mere 13 microrongens per second, in contrast to the levels Vorobyov had since recorded, about 4,000 times higher. Between the two men, Brykhanov sided with Korobenikov. Through the morning, however, more and more people would come forward with more and more negative news that sided against his current beliefs. Eventually, Dyatlov joined them in the bunker, a cigarette in hand, and showing them the power surge that had occurred after the AZ5 button was pressed. This seemed to snap Brykhanov out of his miserable state, and he called Moscow, reporting that the reactor may have been destroyed, an explosion possibly originating in the control and system protection tank, where gases from the reactor may have been discharged during the power surge. More military staff arrived and continued to pressure Brykhanov for more information, forcing him to sign numerous reports, including some suggesting that the reactor could still be repaired, before the place fell into sight. Vorobyov came with high radiation levels, but Bryukhanov still sided with Korobeinikov, whom he trusted more. At 8 a.m, Bryukhanov finally left the small bunker for a meeting with Vladimir Malamud, second secretary of the Kiev Communist Party, where he tried to assure him of the safety of the situation. This time, Vorobyov delivered his radiation reports, and Bryukhanov accepted it, but declined to notify the population under pressure from Malamud. They declined again to notify the construction workers of Units 5 and 6 of the danger, for similar reasons. When the first members of the government commission arrived, Bryukhanov left the bunker to greet them, and finally confessed to them that the reactor had been destroyed. He brought some back to the nuclear power plant, while others surveyed the scene from above. While they surveyed the building, he remained in the bunker, even as photographs from the sky and ground were presented. Still, the actions of Bryukhanov and his chief engineer Fomin convinced some senior members of the government commission that the situation was not severe as initially feared. They took Bryukhanov with them to discuss their next steps. In the subsequent meeting, Bryukhanov finally admitted that the reactor had been destroyed, having seen graphite blocks and concluding they must have been ejected from Unit 4. However, with Voloshenko's claims of potential panic on his mind, Bryukhanov tried to silence Serafim Vorobyov again when he proposed evacuation, and then accepted the Minister of Energy, Anatoly Mayoret's, task to draft up a plan to restore Unit 4, despite admitting he believed the reactor was destroyed. With the arrival of the major members of the government commission, such as Legasov and Shabina, that evening, Bryukhanov was effectively stripped of all his duties. Still, he remained at the nuclear power plant, even as his family were evacuated, coordinating his response from the bunker under the main administration building, and relaying information between the nuclear power plant and the government commission in Pripyat. If an action wasn't taken correctly, it fell on Bryukhanov to complete the task, under threat of imprisonment or even worse punishment. For instance, when a convoy carrying liquid nitrogen refused to enter the exclusion zone in early May, Bryukhanov was tasked with finding the tankers and bringing them to Unit 4. They only did so when soldiers surrounded their tanker trucks. Eventually, he was relocated to Krasnochki, or the fairy tale summer camp, where at night they would try to identify the causes of the accident. In interviews with the KGB, Bryukhanov insisted that Fomin was of guilt, not him, for suggesting that it was a simple electrical test. Through this, carrying out orders of the government commission and replacing the sick or irradiated workers, Brykhanov's body began to give out. His skin became chalky, and his eyes bloodshot. On May 22nd, Brykhanov requested a holiday to visit his wife Valentina and son Oleg in Crimea. He was given permission and flew south for a week's holiday. When he returned in the last days of May, Brykhanov found out he had been replaced as director of the nuclear power plant. Brykhanov had been demoted to deputy head of the Industrial Technical Department, a newly created role where Brykhanov was banished to a small desk in a back office, while everyone awaited his arrest. On Wednesday, July 2nd, 1986, Brykhanov was summoned to Moscow for a Politburo meeting. As he said goodbye to Vladimir Malamud, who you may remember arrived at the nuclear power plant on the morning of April 26, Malamud gave him a warm embrace. On July 3rd, the meeting began, and at 7 p.m. that night, Gorbachev laid the blame of the feet of Brykhanov and the chief engineer Nikolai Fomin for overseeing what he called criminal negligence at the nuclear power plant. By the end of the meeting, he'd been ejected from the Communist Party. Upon arrival in Kiev, Brykhanov was summoned to the Leningrad Hotel to give a statement, detailing his answers to a series of questions over in excess of 90 pages of notes. Once he was done, he returned to the fairy tale summer camp. The news of Brykhanov's accused guilt broke the evening of July 19th and was headlining news on July 20th. When his mother eventually saw the news on the television, she ran out onto the street in a state of depressed panic, where she collapsed and died. Life continued to worsen for Brykhanov. A few days after returning from his mother's funeral, Brykhanov was summoned to the prosecutor's office. There, on August 13th, 1986, after being interrogated for almost 4 hours, he was charged with breaking Article 220, Paragraph 2, and Article 165 of Ukrainian law, a breach of safety regulations at an explosion-prone plant or facility, and abuse of power, respectively. He was led out by plainclothes officers of the KGB, condemned to spend almost the next year in a holding cell. He decided to take with him some educational materials, hoping to learn English in his time in prison. The trial began after some delay due to Fomin's health on July 7, 1986. Bryukhanov pleaded not guilty to breaking Article 220, but guilty to Article 165, which carried a sentence of 5 years in prison. Through the trial, Bryukhanov remained calm and articulate, as he always had. Let us have a look at Brykhanov's courtroom testimony. Prosecutor Yuri Shadrin: did you comply with the personal management guidelines fully? Bryukhanov: yes. Shadrin: what prevented you from establishing a training centre? Why was it absent at the nuclear power plant while you were the nuclear power plant director? Bryukhanov remained silent. Shadrin: once a month, according to the guidelines, you were obliged to make a rounds of the personal workplaces. Did you comply with the requirements? Bryukhanov: those are so-called night rounds. Yes, I could not do them in 1986 due to my workload, but I made daily rounds of the turbine room and the control rooms, etc. The prosecutor: there are certain procedures, a log of inspection rounds to be maintained. The last entry you made is dated 1978. There is your order to make inspection rounds 2 to 3 times a year, the one issued in 1986. Who had authorized you to revoke the guidelines? Bryukhanov: I do not remember such an order. Shadrin: you issued it in 1986. Shadrin: in the first quarter of 1986, you disabled safety and interlocking systems 6 times, from February 6 to April 26, according to the log entries of the Deputy Chief of the Thermal Instruments and Control Section. These actions were made without agreeing with the superior authorities. Those are deviations. Bryukhanov: I did not know that, but I can explain. It is not appropriate to shut up a reactor unit due to some minor reasons. Shadrin: this is wrong. This is against the rules. The assistant prosecutor: did you know that Kharkiv specialists would measure vibrations of the turbine generator? Bryukhanov: I knew that it was always done. We always did it. The assistant prosecutor: for several years, the rundown tests were conducted and always failed. Did you know about that? Bryukhanov: I did not know. The assistant prosecutor: are you not interested in operational issues? Bryukhanov: I was interested a lot, but I could not know everything. Technical specialists are available for these matters. The assistant prosecutor: what is a general accident? Bryukhanov: it is a radiation accident, affecting the reactor and the nuclear power plant site. The assistant prosecutor: at about 2 a.m, you ordered that the phone operators activate the alert notification. Why did you not repeat that order within the day? Bryukhanov: yes, formally, I did not do that. Judge Raymond Bryce: Bryukhanov, after the indictment we asked you whether you plead guilty. You said, yes, I am guilty, but now you say you are not guilty. Bryukhanov: I am guilty in negligence as a manager, but as for those articles, I do not understand them. Bryce: now you say that everything was good, that you did all you had to, in other words, that you are not guilty and plead not guilty. There were difficulties with the training simulator. You did not know about the program. You signed the unit commissioning protocol without knowledge of the failure to complete the program. Where then do you see guilt? Please tell us to know your position. Bryukhanov: in lapses and overlooks. Bryce: where are there lapses and overlooks? Bryukhanov: in all issues raised by the investigation. Bryce: the expert asked you on the program, when the tests were conducted, what, do you think, were the deviations of the personnel? Bryukhanov: it was a lack of coordination. Launching 4 reserve pumps in addition to 4 already operating ones. It was not clear where the excess steam should be discharged to. Bryukhanov accepted guilt where necessary, but he and his lawyer hoped to avoid the more serious charges. This hope was shot down on July 29th, when he and all 5 men on trial were found guilty. As he remained steadfast, his wife fainted in the audience as investigators insisted that she get a divorce. She did not. Bryukhanov was driven in a black van to a train station, where he boarded one of the infamously deadly Soviet Stolypin cars. It took him 2 weeks to travel the 700 kilometers to Donetsk, and the penitentiary where everyone was curious to see the culprit of the Chernobyl disaster. He never saw the birth of his granddaughter. On September 11th, 1991, Bryukhanov was released from prison for good behaviour, having spent the last 3 months in compulsory labour in the town of Uman near Kiev. He returned to a district of Kiev dubbed Little Pripyat, now filling with former and current Chernobyl workers, emaciated and nothing like the man who had built the power plant they worked at. Brukhanov's infamy as a culprit of the Chernobyl disaster had been swept away with the publication of INSAG 7, lying almost all of the blame at the feet of the designers. Brukhanov hoped to return to the nuclear power plant, but he would have to wait a few years. In 1992, he took up a role at the Ukrainian Ministry of Energy's International Trade Department, Internergo, and by 1995 he was appointed deputy head of the Internergo Association. He had opportunities to visit the nuclear power plant and give interviews where possible as a consultant for Ukraine Internergo until 2008. His later health began to give way. In 2015, he suffered the first in a series of strokes, a second one in 2016. In 2015, almost 80 years old, Bryukhanov finally retired as a consequence of his failing eyesight. Parkinson's disease set in, and Bryukhanov became more reclusive and introverted than ever. On the 13th of October 2021, Bryukhanov passed away, aged 85. He is buried in Kiev. The tragic life of Bryukhanov is by far one of the most unusual. There are so few people in his situation who could have reached that height, and his fall was far worse than many expected. The Bryukhanov family lives on. I wish them good health.